honorable chief guests and personalities on the main table, intellectuals, academicians, and the diplomat, as well as the faculty, the students, and the guests for this conference. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Dr. Khalid Manzoor Bhatt, for inviting me to speak on this occasion. And I must also mention that I and Mushahid Sahab have a long history of being colleagues in the past. And this conference has provided me an opportunity to share the panel with him after many years. My focus today would be to highlight certain issues and problems that we often face when we try to evaluate democracy. That is, how do we look at democracy? What are the issues and how it has evolved over the years, and some of the problems are inherent in its evolution, and what are the basic challenges which I think the participant of the conference would be discussing today and tomorrow. Democracy is the most cherished system of governance today. Even dictatorships, one-party states, or the military governments adopt some attributes of democracy to be labeled as a democratic system or a democratic leader. And some of the military coup leaders who assume power often argue that their effort is not against democracy, but against the way the political power is being exercised in that particular country, and they would ultimately introduce what they call a genuine type of democracy. And nowadays, what we see is that the military and the bureaucratic elite prefer a role rather than directly ruling the country, which makes it difficult to classify a political system as partial democracy, full democracy, or something else. However, despite the complexities in the system of governance labeled as democracy, despite the fact that the progression of democracy in all countries is not in a unilinear fashion. When you talk of democracy, there is a progression as well as a reversal in this process. Therefore, the dilemma is that this process experiences reverses, and we can only talk about less democracy or more democracy rather than talking in terms of 100% democracy. And it requires updating and changes over a period of time. The problem why we have difficulties in defining democracy and talking about its quality. Different countries have a democratic system, but the quality of democracy can vary from system to system and country to country. Why is this problem? The reason being that democracy is a multi-layered system, and it has different layers. So it depends how you focus on different layers of democracy. And let me very quickly mention those layers, and you think about the problems of understanding democracy. One, sometimes we focus at the formal structure of democracy, the provisions in the constitutional framework, which are important, but that's not all in democracy. It's one layer of democracy. The second layer is how the system actually functions, how the system actually works. That is, realities on the ground. Those have to be taken into account. Third layer is the notion of quality of human fiber. Ultimately, success and failure of democracy depends on the quality of leadership. That is, who are the power elite in a country, what is their orientation, that is also role of society and all those who peddle influence in the society. To what extent they are committed to democracy at the operational level, at the reality level. Next layer is a system of checks and balances is required so that there is no institutional imbalance in the political system. If there is an institutional imbalance in the system, then you have problems with the democracy. Then in democracy, we also have a debate, the notion of glorification of the state. That is an argument that state is the ultimate authority, ultimate power, and you cannot have any right against the state. State can dominate you. Versus the notion of natural rights of human beings, that there are certain fundamental rights, civil and political, which a state cannot deny under any circumstances. Therefore, we question the absolute supremacy of the state. The problem is, what is genuine democracy? There are different notions of democracy. Very briefly, I may mention here Western liberal democracy with the capitalist economy and also some attributes of the welfare state, a model that has influenced a lot more countries. Second is the notion of Marxist and socialist pattern of governance and the economy, where argument is that free economy exploits the common person. Therefore, how do you manage these issues now, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, how things are being managing? I think there are three basic issues which are important for analysis of democracy. That is, should a state must step in to protect the rights and interests of the common people? Should that be the task? Second, should state provide certain basic protections and basic facilities to its citizens? That's second criteria. And the final criteria is whom democracy is serving. That is, who are the beneficiary of a democratic system existing in a country? Who are the major beneficiaries? And if you want to understand the challenges, modern challenges to democracy, you have to pay attention to the fact that democracy has been through an evolutionary process. It has developed gradually, and it flourishes or gets undermined through the same process, the gradual process. Going back to ancient Greece, we can talk about 507 BC, when in Athens a system of consultation of citizens was introduced by the rulers at that time. And the ideal of Athenian democracy was equality amongst citizens, respect, liberty, and respect for law, that is rule of law, justice, and they had direct democracy. Some contribution has been made by the Roman rulers. However, the problem was although it was a direct democracy, the problem was that the notion of citizenship was limited. Every human being was not citizen, and the rights were with the citizen. And from Greece, this notion of democracy moved to Europe, England, Europe, and also to North America, where it developed for several centuries. And we can talk about British or European history, or how it developed. 1215, the Magna Carta, 1789, the French Revolution, which emphasized freedom, equality, and brotherhood. These three notions. And but even in these countries, when the notion of limiting the powers of the rulers developed gradually, starting from Magna Carta of 1215, the rights were being transferred to the elite, to the nobility of their countries, rather than to common people. It was in the 19th and the 20th century that you had the notion of common people having rights, and also right to vote was also extended gradually. And it was in the 20th century that the right to vote was extended to females, to women. First it was given to males only, and then in the 20th century that goes to female. And then it gradually developed after the Second World War, then Cold War era. I'm just briefly mentioning milestones, not going in detail. Then again, the breakdown of Soviet Union, when the Western writers talked about the end of history, and they were arguing that the only game in the town is democracy. But we have seen that in the beginning of the 21st century, the reversal process also starts, especially with September 2001, when terrorism incidents took place. In the post-9/11 period, there have been doubts raised to what extent democracy would be flourishing even in Western countries. Those who have experienced the United States before 9/11 and after 9/11, they know that how democracy and civil and political rights suffered even in liberal democratic country. And now with Donald Trump's phenomena, there are now serious questions about democracy, rise of extremism, notion of anti-immigration, and also populist leaders who claim to speak in the name of public, and in that process they undermine democracy over a period of time. Therefore, I would say that when we talk of democracy, you have to identify the basic features of democracy. That is theoretical abstraction, that what are the basic characteristics and basic qualities of democracy. And then you examine against those basic characteristics, what are the challenges. And I would just briefly mention 4 dimensions of challenges that modern democracy faces. One challenge, what we call the cultural challenge, the political challenge, second, third, societal challenges, and fourth, the economic challenges. And I would just, very briefly mention about these. Now, cultural challenges, we actually mean that in addition to having a democratic constitutional order, to what extent the democratic culture exists in that society. That is the orientation and disposition of the leadership, orientation and disposition of the society as a whole. How do they view the processes of democracy? And in addition to written provisions of a constitution, how far democratic conventions, unwritten democratic traditions have developed in that country, and they are respected. Because it's not the provisions only, but the spirit of democracy that has to be respected. And it is the question of, culture. And also, Lack of political continuity undermines democracy. Long periods of authoritarian rule in a country undermine the prospects of democracy. These are cultural things. In the political field, the important thing is to what extent you can hold fair, free, and transparent elections. To what extent elections are being viewed as an opportunity to elect your representative, to elect your leaders freely. That's important. And also, how fairly, how judiciously state resources are being used in that country, and to what extent is the institutional imbalance in a particular country, to what extent the civil and political rights are guarantees. That's the political challenges. I'm sure this will be discussed in the conference. Economic challenges, just very briefly. The experience suggests that democracy requires economic growth, economic development, prosperity. That helps democracy. However, it is not merely the growth that matters. What matters is who benefits from that growth. In whose favor is that economic development that is taking place? If economic development creates disparities, imbalances, concentration of power, then it's a challenge to democracy, and it undermines democracy. And development requires an inclusive development. If you are trying to help a community, if you are trying to help a region, ask the people what are their needs and what are their aspirations, and try to meet their needs and aspirations rather than adopting a colonial attitude of giving them charity. Yes, we think that people of this region need A, B, C, we'll give you this. Ask the people what are their problems. Where shoe pinches, ask the person who's wearing that shoe, rather than you are trying to decide that. So I would conclude my presentation by saying that establishing and promoting democracy is not an easy task for any state. It requires patience, it requires time, and also requires a leadership that believes in democracy and practices democracy. That's a very critical factor. And less the gap between aspirations and performance, between what people desire and what they get. Lesser the gap between the two, the better for peaceful changes in the constitutional and the political state. And non-partisan role of the state institutions and processes is very critical. If state institutions are partisan, then you run into a lot of trouble. That is, to what extent a system can assign primacy to the interests of the common people, and how legitimate is the use of coercive power of the state. Every state has coercive power. To what extent you think that the use of coercive power against public, against people, is legitimate or it is illegitimate? And also, the final factor, just examine and judge. Do the people respect the state and its institutions, or they fear the state and its institution? This question will give you the right kind of answer. If they fear the state, then consequences are very different from a situation where people respect. So I think it's a continuous process, and with all difficulties and problems, we need to support the efforts to promote democratic values, institutions, and processes. Thank you.